This is part 1 of Unit 14, and as you can probably see on the board, we're going to be talking about the Cold War today. And of course, first thing we need to do is figure out what the Cold War is, and you know this already, but just in case if you need some clarification, the Cold War is the kind of phony war or war of words, or the competition or the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union or Communist Russia at the time. And the reason it's called the Cold War again is because there's no real actual fighting that usually takes place. It's all kind of behind the scenes and more of a chess match than an actual war. And this is something that you've studied before, so I'm pretty confident that you know what the Cold War is. As far as what causes the Cold War, that's a little bit tougher to define, but there are some things that we need to go through as far as why does this competition or rivalry between the Soviet Union and America exist, or how does it develop? The first thing is it's basically over communism versus capitalism, or their way of life versus our way of life. There are different points of view or different philosophies. Communism is the idea that the government should eliminate the rich and poor by creating one class of people that is all equal, and they do that by the government collecting all of the value of the country and giving everyone an equal share in that value. Democracy and capitalism, on the other hand, is the idea that people have a lot of the freedom to make those choices. The government doesn't own anything, and so the wealth gets distributed however it gets distributed. And so they're just very different points of view. One is controlled by the government very heavily, because the government again wants to make sure everyone gets an equal value of the wealth in the country, or that the country possesses. In democracy, it's more of a competition. Capitalism is you get what you deserve based on your talent and your effort and these sorts of things. So they're just very different points of view. America saw communism as a threat to our way of life because it is government takeover or government ownership of things, and the people in a communist country don't have a lot of say or as much freedom. Basically, in communism, you do what the government tells you to do because it's what's best for the country. And so we saw that as a threat to our way of life because it's very, very different. And they as well. Another cause of the conflict is there's lots of distrust between these two groups. Even though we were allies during the war, we were uneasy allies because of the differences of philosophy. But also there are some things that happen in the war that create some more mistrust and a bigger gulf between this. The biggest issue is the leader of Soviet Union at this time is Joseph Stalin, and he has a lot of distrust of the West because he thought that they intentionally delayed attacking Hitler on the Western Front, or Normandy, or France, however you want to say it. He thought that the Allies intentionally did that because they didn't like the Russians. And you might remember that Russia suffered more casualties than anyone else during the war. There was lots of atrocities or horrible fighting that took place between Germany and Russia during the war. And Stalin blames the West for a lot of that. He said, you didn't attack till spring of 1944. You could have done that a lot sooner and saved a lot of Russian lives and a lot of heartache. And so he has a lot of mistrust. And we mistrust him as well because Stalin has broken some promises as well. So there's already some dislike or distrust or some friction between the sides at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, also only the Soviet Union and the United States are left as really what we call superpowers, powerful countries that are able to really greatly influence foreign affairs. Britain and France have been very weakened, and most of the other countries were really weakened after World War II. So it's really just the United States and Russia that are left after the war as far as powerful and wealthy nations that can have a big influence in the world. So perhaps it's just natural that a rivalry would develop between those two. And a big cause of that as well is there was a big feeling in the United States that Russia wanted to spread communism and take over the world, because after World War II they started to gobble up countries, especially in Eastern Europe, and Russia was saying, we're doing that for defensive purposes. We don't want to be attacked by Germany again. This is just part of our plan for defending ourselves, to make sure that we don't have to fight Germany in another world war after they've already done it twice. But in America, we were thinking perhaps Russia is going to perhaps take over the world in an attempt to spread communism. And so these two superpowers are just natural rivals, because they both are powerful countries, and they're unsure of each country's plan, what their future holds, what they want to do in foreign affairs. So those are some of the causes of the Cold War. That's a real just brief overview, but you should have some idea of why this rivalry or competition between the two exists. If you had to pick one, it's really just the difference of philosophy: communism versus capitalism / democracy. So some events to know about the Cold War, some things in addition to know. It really starts when former Prime Minister Winston Churchill gives a speech called the Iron Curtain speech, in which he is cautioning the world. In this speech he says an iron curtain has descended upon Europe, which he was referring to Russia again taking over Eastern Europe. And what had happened then is Europe is pretty much getting divided. And what Churchill is saying in this speech is that the world is going to get divided up into two camps: the Russians and those that are favoring the other philosophy of capitalism or democracy. And he's warning that the world is going to end up like Europe is going to get split up in two, and it's an iron curtain. And the reason he uses that terminology is because it's finite. I mean, it's powerful. It's it's very definite. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. And this is really kind of the start of it. He's really warning the world that this is on the horizon. This is going to be what's going on for the next year, this dividing of the world and trying to get people on your side and keep people from going to the other side. And this is when Russia starts to get known in circles as the evil empire. Ronald Reagan will use this in his attempt to end the communist Russia country in the 1980s. This is basically when it's a us versus them. This is when that takes place. This is when America and other countries start to think of Russia as evil, as our enemy. And so if you ever come across that, you need to know kind of what it's referring to. Okay? What gets developed then in America is a policy known as containment, that we want to keep communism from spreading, put it in a Tupperware container, if you will, put the lid on it tight and keep it from spreading. This becomes the U.S. foreign policy for the next 30 plus years. We are going to try to do what we can to keep communism from spreading to other parts of the globe. Again, this is largely a reaction to what Stalin is doing in Europe, where he's taking over places like Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, those countries in Eastern Europe. Americans start to say, where is he going to stop? And especially the leaders in America warn that this is dangerous and we need to keep communism from spreading because it's a threat to our way of life. One of the biggest proponents of this is a guy named George Kennan, who is a foreign policy advisor. He's advising President Truman that this is what the Russians do, in fact, intend to do, and we do need to contain it. That should be our #1 goal. And so President Truman then takes a hard stance against communism and invokes a new foreign policy called the Truman Doctrine, which basically states we will do anything from military aid to economic aid to giving them money to technology to help countries stay away from communism and be more democratic or more capitalistic. And so the Truman Doctrine is kind of playing on the Monroe Doctrine, and this is a significant event in our U.S. history because we generally go 180 from our pre-World War I and World War II stance of isolationism, where we want to stay out of foreign affairs. Now we're going the exact opposite, saying we're going to be heavily involved in foreign affairs, and we're going to do anything and everything we can to keep places from becoming communism, because we see that as a threat to America's interests and to America's way of life. And so we are going to be heavily involved with foreign affairs from this point on. And this takes place early after World War II, so we're talking late 1940s. So America's going in a very much different direction. So after this is kind of the line is drawn in the sand here with the Truman Doctrine, I have some events here which I'm calling battles in quotation marks, because again, the Cold War, there's no real actual fighting that usually takes place, but it's more indirect things like spying and trying to win other countries onto your side. So these are some of the early battles or events you need to know in the Cold War. Right away after the war, the countries of Europe are devastated. Their land is destroyed, cities are destroyed, people are homeless, they need to rebuild. So the decision is made, again, kind of playing off the Truman Doctrine, that we should help them. Not only because this is the right thing to do, it's the humanitarian thing to do, but if we give countries money and help them rebuild, then they will be friendly to us, and that means they will be anti-communist. So the idea is we need to help Europe rebuild, otherwise Russia will, and they will become heavily dominated by Russia instead of the United States. Remember, we talked about spheres of influence and class. So this is what the Marshall Plan is. It's America's plan to aid a war-torn Europe and help them rebuild. And it's named after one of the generals, George Marshall. And basically what it is we're going to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to help Europe rebuild so that they become friendly to us and not to Russia. The next kind of event that happens then is the crisis in Berlin that we talked about a little bit in class already. After the war, you know that England, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union each had a part of conquered Germany. And after a while, the plan was to reunite them and let them pick their own government and leaders and, self-determine their own fate. Well, what ends up happening is the United States, England, and France decide to unify their zones of occupation and let them take over. But Soviet Union changes their mind. Stalin had agreed to this earlier at the Potsdam Conference. But now he changes his mind because he does not want Germany that's united, because he thinks that is going to be a problem for defending his country, because he had been invaded twice by Germany. And so what ends up ultimately happening is Germany then never reunites after the war. It is split into East Germany, which is a communist country. That's the part that the Soviet Union or Russia controlled. And then West Germany, which was the other three countries reuniting, and West Germany becomes a free democratic state then. In connection with this, the capital city of Berlin is also split into East and West. So ultimately, West Berlin becomes a tiny island of democracy surrounded by communism, because it's deep in the heart of the communist East Germany. And this is one of the first crises that develops after the war, and you see this competition or split between the communists and the capitalists. What happens next then is very typical in the Cold War. Kind of a chess match develops. The Soviet Union wants to get rid of West Berlin, this little tiny island of democracy, as I stated. And so what they end up doing is blockading it, and they cut off electricity and water to the democratic city of West Berlin, thinking that this will just then be abandoned by the West, that the United States and its allies will let this become a communist country, and so forth. But because of the Truman Doctrine, when we said we agree to fight the spread of communism everywhere, Truman digs in, and the United States and its allies refuse to let this become another part of the communist empire. So what they do is they start to drop in supplies via airplane to West Berlin, and this is called the Berlin Airlift. And again, it's a chess match. Soviet Union blockades them, so what are we going to do? Are we going to fight? Are we going to abandon it? Or we come up with another option, we're going to fly in supplies. And that's pretty much how the Cold War goes. One country does something, and another country reacts to it and goes back and forth. And all the time we're trying to avoid direct confrontation between each other, but there's all these kind of guessing games or strategic games going around. And so we refuse to give up West Berlin. We fight for it, and eventually the blockade is lifted, and life goes on, and West Berlin stays democratic. Then we have another event where NATO is created, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which basically is a military alliance of the Western countries of Europe. They were very afraid of Russian aggression. The Soviet Union had taken over Eastern Europe. Are they going to come get other countries in Western Europe? And they were small countries and fairly weak countries, especially after World War II, so they were afraid that Russia would come and gobble them up. So what they decided to do was form an alliance together, saying if you pick on one country, it's like an attack on all of us, and if we all pool our resources together, we will be a much stronger defense. And the United States is a part of NATO as well. And so it's a military alliance to try to defend Western Europe from communist expansion. Well, then the chess match goes on again, and so the Soviet Union thinks, well, we have to have a pact with our Eastern allies so that we are not taken over by the capitalists, and that's the Warsaw Pact. That's the communist Eastern Europe countries alliance, saying we're defending ourselves against the West. So if you ever come across those terms, you know what they are and kind of what they're intended to do. And these are some of the early confrontations or chess match battles in the Cold War. One of the big things that happens is in 1949, China falls to the communists. Mao Zedong takes over. There had been a civil war in China before World War II, and then when they were attacked by Japan, the civil war is put on hold, and the capitalists, or those wanting democracy, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists of Mao Zedong, they unite to fight their common enemy. And during the war, Mao gets stronger, he learns more, and so when the Japanese are defeated, the civil war picks back up, and Mao and the communists win and take over China. Though this is a huge, huge threat and scare to America and the West, because Russia is the largest country and China is a large country, but also the largest in population. They just added 1 billion communists. This really freaks out people in America because the fears of communists spreading and taking over the world now seem a reality. They have a very powerful ally, and this leads rise to something called the domino theory then, basically saying we need to really fight communism everywhere, because if we don't, it's going to be like dominoes. This country will become communist, even if it's a tiny, insignificant country, third world country. But if we don't stop them, then all the countries in the region will fall to communism like dominoes. So it's the idea that if one country becomes communist, more in the region will follow. And again, this is leading us to that we're going to fight to stop the spread of communism idea. It's just the idea that if more countries will fall to communism if we don't stop this. And so this leads to the Korean War, which is often called the Forgotten War. And you don't hear about the Korean War very much, but this takes place in the 1950s, where Truman sends troops to help South Korea fight off communist North Korea. The country had been divided, and there's a civil war again between communists and those that want democracy. And because of the Truman Doctrine and the belief of the domino theory, we say we have to fight this. We have to try to help South Korea prevent a communist takeover. Another thing at stake here is the United Nations. The United Nations is a new organization, as you know, created after World War II. And this group was trying to talk tough because the communists in North Korea was trying to take over, and they were trying to prevent that aggressive move. And so the United States wanted to help the United Nations look tough and powerful, so that countries would feel that they have to listen to the United Nations when they say don't do something. And so we had to help the United Nations in this regard as well. So those are both the reasons why Truman sends troops to Korea, but it's really to prevent the spread of communism, as we've been talking about. And the war goes on for about 3 years, and I'm sad to say that after the war is over, there's been almost no change in territory. The split between North Korea and South Korea remains. The territory is almost exactly the same as it was when the war started. and North Korea remains communist, South Korea remains democratic. So you could say it's a victory because we didn't allow communism to take over the whole country, but we didn't get rid of communism in North Korea either. And this is the early 1950s. This is President Truman making this decision. And this, again, is significant, really, because it shows that America is willing to back up what it said. We are willing to do everything to stop communism from spreading, even using military force. And this shows our resolve and that we're willing to do this. So that's kind of why the Korean War is significant. And please don't forget the part of the UN. The UN is a brand new nation, but one of the problems that had happened with the League of Nations is it didn't really have any power. It would say, don't do something, or you shouldn't do something to a country, but it had no power to enforce that. Well, the United Nations actually has its own military, and with their military and support of the U.S., it was the first time military was used by the UN to try to enforce their decisions. And I don't want you to forget that part as well. Finally, then, the other thing that we're going to talk about here early on in the Cold War is this idea of the arms race. Now, you know right away that the United States had the atomic bomb and no other country did. But about 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union's tested and perfected their own atomic bomb, and so they had it as well. And so what begins is the arms race, or the competition to see who can have the biggest and best weapons, who can have the most nukes, and later on, after we each have thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons and bombs that are even stronger than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then it becomes, you know, who can have the better tanks and planes and all these kind of things. And I know you've heard of this before, so we don't have to go through this a lot. But the arms race then becomes a big part of the Cold War, who can have the best military or weapons, and that goes on for the whole duration of the Cold War. So much so that we get so many nuclear weapons that we destroy the world. We have enough to destroy the world about 12 times over. And North Dakota played a pretty big role in this. I don't know if you know this or not. There were so many nuclear weapons in North Dakota that if we had withdrawn from the United States and become our own country, we would have had like the 4th or 5th largest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world. So we had a lot of them here, and we were a big part of that arms race that took place. The last thing that I want to talk about then in this section is how the Cold War impacted life at home. And it had a pretty big, significant impact because there was a second Red Scare. The Red Scare, the first one you might remember, took place after World War I. There was a big fear of foreigners. Communism had taken over Russia, and so there was a fear of communism coming into America. Well, this Red Scare is even worse than that. So again, it's a fear of communism is really what the Red Scare is, and we were told that communists were everywhere in our country, and they were spying on us, and they were trying to help communism take over our country. So this led to a couple of famous spy cases. The Rosenbergs were a couple that worked for the government and supposedly selling secrets, and Hiss as well was someone that was convicted of being a spy. So suddenly we were told that spies were everywhere, that they were trying to help Russia gain information about us so they could defeat us in a war, because people thought there was going to be a war between Russia and the United States, communism versus democracy. And these famous spy cases took place, and it only heightened that fear, that intensity that there are spies everywhere and you can't trust anybody, and we got to find these communist sympathizers. This leads us to Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was the guy that leads the hunt or the investigation for communists. He became kind of the guy in America who said, these guys are everywhere, we need to find them, we need to get rid of them, and I'm just the guy to do it. So McCarthy is the guy that leads the hunt or the search for communists in America. McCarthyism is this idea that spies and communists are everywhere and we need to root them out. And this becomes what's called a witch hunt. Basically what happens is McCarthy just starts to say spies are everywhere, and he starts to try to investigate to find them. And people become very afraid because what happens then is the Senate forms a committee, and McCarthy's a powerful member of that committee, and they basically bring people before them and saying, you're a member of this group, what are you doing? Are you a communist or not? And it can really ruin people's lives. And he really turns up the heat on this. And he becomes very powerful and famous because of that. And so because of this fear of communism and this idea that spies are everywhere, suddenly people have to start taking loyalty oaths. They have to pledge their allegiance or show their loyalty to their country if you work for the government and things like that. And then the Senate forms this House Un-American Activities Committee, and they haul people before them and ask them all kinds of questions. What money do you give to this group and that group, and what magazines do you subscribe to, and are you a member of this group, and so on and so forth, because they're saying these people are communists. And McCarthy's leading all this. He's the guy that's pushing behind the scenes, and he really has no real evidence for this. He just puts people up on the witness stand and just bullies them and makes them look questionable because they have the spotlight on them and they don't come up with the answers fast enough. And it becomes really, really scary to many Americans, especially people like in Hollywood. There are a group called the Hollywood 10. These are the 10 biggest communists in Hollywood. They get hauled before this committee. They refuse to answer questions, some of them get put in jail. And what really scares people is that people that are your friends, your neighbors, are going to turn on you. They're going to be labeled a communist, and you get put on a blacklist. A blacklist then is when you won't get hired because you're seen as a traitor, as a communist, or you're un-American, these kinds of things. And this became a real concern for people, especially people a little bit higher up in power and wealth, because McCarthy was going after anyone and everybody. And basically, even if you got put on the stand and labeled as maybe a communist, pretty much you could expect your friends and neighbors to turn on you. You might get on a blacklist and lose your job, because people were told that communists, again, were evil. They were our enemy. They were trying to destroy us. And there was such a big fear of communism that people were really buying into this. And McCarthy became kind of a very powerful, famous figure because people were really afraid. And all he had to do was just kind of point a finger at you, and you would be considered, a traitor or enemy. And this becomes a big part of the 1950s, this search for communists, which later on becomes a witch hunt, because what happens is McCarthy kind of goes too far and he gets drunk with power and he starts accusing everyone, and he says they're in our universities, they're in our government, they're in our army, and he really just gets really arrogant, and he puts people on the stand and he bullies them and he makes fun of them and he tries to intimidate them, and he really has no evidence whatsoever. He just uses innuendo and slander, and he just makes stuff up as he goes along. And eventually what ends up happening is the Senate kind of puts a stop to it and says enough is enough. This guy's kind of a sham or a fraud. Kind of what happens is he's thinking that perhaps he'll become president one day, so he's trying to build a name for himself. But it backfires. He goes too far, and he gets kicked out of the Senate because he kind of abuses his power, and he kind of fades away into history. But the point here being that people were really afraid of communism at home, especially in the 1950s. And they allowed this infringement of our rights. Again, when we become very scared, that's a common theme. And they allowed these people to be attacked and to have their rights taken away and lose their jobs and get kicked out of their homes and things like that, because they were seen as traitors. And another thing that illustrates the paranoia or the fear of communism is that houses often became equipped with bomb shelters during the Cold War to protect them from a nuclear war, which people were sure that was going to come eventually. And we'll see some clips in class that illustrate this, that this became just another feature of a home, like a garage or a kitchen or anything else. And when you see things like McCarthyism and these bomb shelters, it really tells you how intense the fear is. And so when you think 1950s and you're talking about the Cold War, make sure you remember that there's that great intense fear or red scare that's going on, because that really dictates what's going on in people's lives and what they're thinking, and it infects a lot of their choices and decisions. And we'll see a little bit more of that in part 2, because that's going to be the end of